1925, a man named Louis Ferdinand Lambert was walking through his mushroom farm in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, when he noticed something odd. One of the mushrooms was white, not the brownish-gray color of every other mushroom on his farm. Pure white. A single plant, standing out from the hundreds around it, the result of a spontaneous genetic mutation that no one had planned and no one could have predicted. Lambert picked it up and brought it to his laboratory. What happened next is the reason every mushroom you have ever bought at a grocery store looks the way it does. Lambert cultivated that white mutation, grew it into a consistent strain, and introduced it to the market. Consumers preferred it immediately, not because it tasted better or was more nutritious, but because it was white. In the 1920s, white meant clean, white meant modern, white meant safe. Within a few decades, the white button mushroom had replaced the original brown variety in nearly every supermarket in America. The entire global white mushroom industry, valued at $76 billion today, traces back to one accidental plant on one farm in Pennsylvania. But here is the part that should make you pause. The mushroom that is killing people right now in California is also white. It has no smell. It has no bitter taste. It produces no visible warning of any kind. It looks almost identical to the mushroom you buy at the store. And after 4,500 years of human beings eating mushrooms, we still have no reliable way to tell the difference with our eyes alone. Before we go further, drop a comment and tell me where in the world you are watching from and what time it is there. I read every one, and I am always curious who is out there. The oldest written evidence of human beings paying attention to mushrooms comes from ancient Egypt, roughly 4,500 years ago. The Egyptians did not treat mushrooms the way we treat them. They did not slice them into omelets or sauté them in butter. They wrote about them in sacred texts. In the Egyptian Book of the Dead, mushrooms are described as the food of the gods, celestial food, the flesh of the gods. The storm god Set was said to have created them by hurling lightning bolts coated in mushroom seed to earth. The mushroom appeared where lightning struck, seemingly from nowhere, without soil or seed or any visible cause. To people living 4,000 years before modern mycology, this was not a metaphor. It was an explanation for something genuinely inexplicable. Plants grew from seeds you could see and plant. Animals came from parents you could identify. But mushrooms appeared overnight after rain, fully formed, on dead wood, on bare earth, on the sides of trees, with no apparent origin. They were, by any reasonable ancient standard, supernatural. If you have ever found a mushroom growing in your yard after a heavy rain and genuinely not known whether it was safe, you were having the same experience as someone standing in a field 4,000 years ago. The confusion is that old. The difference is that we have not solved it. And so the pharaoh issued a decree. Mushrooms were declared the exclusive property of royalty. Common people were forbidden from eating them, in some accounts forbidden from touching them at all. Consuming a mushroom without royal permission was not simply a culinary transgression, it was a theological one. This lasted, in various forms, for centuries. The logic was simple. If mushrooms were the food of the gods, they belonged to the people closest to the gods, and in the ancient world, that was the person sitting on the throne. But that reverence came with a problem that no decree could solve, because the same quality that made mushrooms feel divine, that they appeared from nowhere, that they followed no visible rules, also meant that you could never be entirely certain what you were picking. By the time of the Roman Empire, mushrooms had traveled north and west, from Egypt and the Levant, into the kitchens of the Mediterranean world. The Romans were enthusiastic about them. They had a name for the finest variety, Amanita casearia, the mushroom of Caesar, a golden-orange species that grew in the forests around Rome and was considered the most prized ingredient a cook could obtain. Amanita casearia was served at the tables of senators and emperors. It was expensive, seasonal, and deeply associated with wealth and status. To eat Amanita casearia was to eat the way a Roman of consequence ate. There was one problem with this arrangement. Growing in the same forests, often within a few meters of Amanita casearia, was a different species, Amanita phalloides, the death cap. Pale, almost white, with a slight greenish tinge, not unpleasant to smell, not bitter to taste, and lethal. Ancient Roman sources record numerous deaths from mushroom poisoning among the nobility. People who had every reason to be careful, who employed experienced foragers and trusted cooks, who were eating the most carefully selected ingredients in the most sophisticated kitchens of the ancient world. And still they died. The most famous of these deaths, though the historical record is disputed, is that of the Emperor Claudius. On the evening of October 13th, in the year 54, Claudius sat down to a dinner that included his favorite dish, amanita caesarea, prepared by his personal food taster, a man named Helotus. By morning, Claudius was dead. He was 63 years old, and he had been emperor for 13 years. Ancient historians, including Tacitus and Suetonius, wrote that his fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, had orchestrated the killing. According to these accounts, she arranged for death-cap mushrooms to be mixed into the dish of amanita caesarea, their visual similarity making the substitution nearly impossible to detect. When the toxin began working too slowly, her personal physician, Xenophon, administered a second dose through other means to accelerate the death. Agrippina's motive was straightforward. Claudius had been showing signs of favoring his own son, Britannicus, over Agrippina's son, Nero, as his successor. With Claudius dead, Nero became emperor at 16 years old. Scholars debate whether this account is accurate. Claudius was not in good health, and ancient historians had their own political reasons for portraying Agrippina as a villain. The truth of what happened that October night may be permanently beyond our reach, but what is not in dispute is this: the Romans believed it. They believed a mushroom had changed the course of their empire, and that belief shaped how an entire civilization thought about the food on their tables. For 1,000 years after Rome, mushrooms stayed at the edges of European culture, eaten by the poor, feared by everyone else. It was not until the court of Louis XIV that mushrooms began their long rehabilitation in European aristocratic kitchens. Louis XIV's head gardener, Jean-Baptiste de la Cantonie, one of the most celebrated horticulturalists of the 17th century, learned to cultivate mushrooms successfully for the king's table at Versailles. The king developed a particular fondness for what was then called the rosé des prés, the direct ancestor of the button mushroom, and wanted them year-round. The solution that French growers eventually developed was one of the more unusual chapters in culinary history. Paris sat on top of a vast network of underground limestone quarries, centuries of mining leaving tunnels and chambers running beneath the city in every direction. These tunnels were cool, humid, and dark, conditions ideal for growing mushrooms. Growers began farming them there, in the abandoned rock quarries beneath the streets, pushing beds of horse manure deep into the tunnels where the temperature held steady year-round. By the mid-19th century, there were as many as 600 mushroom operations working beneath Paris. The farmers brought their harvests up through trapdoors cut into cellar floors throughout the city. At the industry's peak, roughly 300 growers were selling 3 million baskets of mushrooms on Parisian markets every year. For the first time in history, mushrooms could be produced in reliable quantity at a price that ordinary people could afford. The food that had been the exclusive possession of Egyptian pharaohs, that had been reserved for Roman senators and French kings, was now available at the market on any Tuesday morning. But the mushroom that came out of those Paris tunnels was not the mushroom that would end up in your refrigerator. That required one more accident, on a farm in Pennsylvania, almost a century later. Louis Ferdinand Lambert had been growing mushrooms commercially for years. His farm in Coatesville was a conventional operation producing the standard brown variety that had been cultivated in Europe since the Paris quarry days. Lambert knew his mushrooms. He had studied mycology formally and understood what he was growing, which is why the white one stopped him. A spontaneous mutation in a mushroom crop is not unheard of, but this one was visually dramatic. A plant that stood out from everything around it, entirely white, where everything else was brown. Lambert isolated it, studied it, and eventually began propagating it. He introduced the white strain to market alongside the existing brown variety and waited to see what happened. The market chose white, almost immediately and almost entirely. The preference had nothing to do with flavor. The portobello mushroom, which became fashionable in American restaurants in the 1980s and 1990s as a meat substitute, is simply the brown cremini grown to full size. It is the same species, Agaricus bisporus, harvested at a different age. Chefs who work with both consistently prefer the cremini's richer, more complex taste. But in 1925, and for decades afterward, the American consumer associated whiteness with cleanliness, safety, and modernity. This was the era of white bread, white sugar, white flour, all of them marketed as the refined, superior version of their browner predecessors. The white mushroom fit perfectly into this framework. It looked like something that had been processed, cleaned, and approved. The brown mushroom looked like something that had come out of the ground, which, of course, both of them had. The mushroom in your refrigerator right now is almost certainly a descendant of Lambert's 1925 mutation. The decision that shaped what mushrooms look like in every grocery store on the planet was never really a decision. It was a preference, built on color, with nothing to do with safety. And here is what that preference for white set up, without anyone realizing it. The death cap, Amanita phalloides, arrived in California in the 1930s. It came with imported ornamental trees from Europe. Its spores carried in the root systems of nursery stock. It established itself quietly in the Bay Area and began to spread. For decades, it was considered a contained problem, a hazard for people who foraged without adequate knowledge, a footnote in the broader story of California's outdoor culture. Poisoning cases occurred each year, usually in small clusters, usually among immigrant communities from Southeast Asia and Eastern Europe, where foraging traditions were strong and the local species were unfamiliar. And then something changed. Death caps are what mycologists call ectomycorrhizal fungi. They form symbiotic relationships with the roots of specific trees, exchanging minerals for sugars. When the death cap arrived in California, it attached primarily to imported European trees. That limited how far it could spread. But then researchers documented something alarming. The death cap had begun forming new relationships with coast live oak, a tree native to California that grows across the Bay Area in enormous numbers. This gave it a year-round energy source from a host species covering millions of acres. Bay Area death caps are now measurably larger and more abundant than death cap populations anywhere else in the world. The 2025 season in California was the worst on record. 47 confirmed poisoning cases, 4 deaths, multiple liver transplants. The medical director of the San Francisco division of the California Poison Control System said she had never seen a season as deadly in terms of both total cases and severity of outcomes. The toxin, amatoxin, is odorless and tasteless. It causes no immediate reaction. The first symptoms, nausea, vomiting, and severe abdominal pain, typically appear 6 to 24 hours after ingestion. By the time a person feels sick enough to seek medical attention, the toxin has already begun destroying liver cells. There is no antidote. In the 2025 California outbreak, several victims initially thought they had food poisoning. By the time they reached emergency rooms, their livers were already in failure. The death cap is pale, smooth, and unremarkable. If you encountered one growing in a park or a garden, you would not know what you were looking at. It looks like a mushroom. This is the problem that 4,500 years of human history with mushrooms has not solved. We can send probes to the edge of the solar system. We can sequence the human genome, but there is still no simple field test that can tell you, standing in front of a mushroom you have never seen before, whether eating it will nourish you or kill you. The foraging community has developed extensive knowledge, guides, training programs, expert networks. All of it helps. None of it is perfect. People who have been foraging for decades still make fatal mistakes, because mushrooms do not follow the rules we want them to follow. They do not advertise their dangers. The qualities that make the deadliest ones so lethal, their resemblance to edible species, their lack of obvious warning signs, are not accidents. They are the product of millions of years of evolutionary pressure that had nothing to do with what was convenient for human beings. The global mushroom market is worth $76 billion. Americans eat roughly 900 million pounds of mushrooms every year, 90% of it Agaricus bisporus, produced in climate-controlled warehouses where every variable is managed, and the uncertainty that surrounded mushrooms for most of human history has been engineered out of the system. Outside that system, the uncertainty remains entirely intact. The pharaoh who reserved mushrooms for royalty was not wrong about one thing. There is something about mushrooms that resists complete human understanding, not in a mystical sense, not because of lightning bolts from the storm god Set, but because the kingdom of fungi operates by rules that are genuinely different from the rules of the plant and animal worlds we are more familiar with. Mushrooms are more closely related, genetically, to animals than to plants. They digest their food externally. The part you see above ground is a small fraction of the organism, which can extend for acres through a root system invisible to the eye. We have learned to grow them. We have learned to eat them, most of us, safely. We have built a $76 billion industry on the back of an accidental mutation from 1925, and we have still not solved the problem that killed the Emperor Claudius. The next time you walk past a mushroom growing at the base of a tree, on the edge of a park, in the grass beside a sidewalk, it might be entirely harmless. It almost certainly is. But it might not be, and there is no way to know from looking. That is not a reason to be afraid of the mushrooms on your plate, which come from controlled farms and carry no meaningful risk. It is a reason to remember that some questions about the natural world do not have the answers we would like them to have, no matter how long we have been asking. 4,500 years in, and the mushroom is still keeping its secrets. If this is the kind of story that makes you look at the ordinary world a little differently, that is exactly what this channel exists to do. Every meal has a history it is not telling you. Subscribe, so you are here for the next one. And drop a comment telling me which food you want us to dig into next. I read every one.